When it comes to Revelation chapter 11, there are certain facts in the text itself that everyone, no matter who they are stuck with. Facts are simply that. They are facts. We can formulate opinions on how they can be interpreted, but everyone is stuck with the facts of the language and grammar of the text, no matter what their opinions or theologies may be. Everyone has the same set of textual facts they must grapple with and explain, if they are going to remain honest. And when Counter-Reformationists get to these facts in Revelation chapter 11, they not only refuse to acknowledge them, they actually use tricks to intentionally hide them from the public. But despite these dishonest tactics by Counter-Reformationists, the facts remain in these texts, precisely as they have always been, for anyone in the public willing to honestly look at them and acknowledge their presence. They don't disappear, just because Counter-Reformationists prefer they not be there. And many premillennialists have come across them in their own personal studies and have realized the problem they create for Counter-Reformation's futurism theology. And some have rightly abandoned the eschatology of futurism altogether because of these facts. And if you look at these facts, you might realize why that happens. The facts of Revelation chapter 11 are: first, the two witnesses are time-framed to come 42 months after the giving of Jerusalem to the Gentiles, which occurred in 130 AD. Depending on how you interpret dating in the book of Revelation, that gives you either 134 AD or 1390 AD as your only two options. So no matter how you read these texts, and no matter which dating method you use, John's text concerning the two witnesses refers to something that has already happened in history. In either case, there is no question about this fact, because John states his timeline in verse 2 and 3 overtly and gives no gap in his description of it, to produce any other option. That is the first and most formidable fact that must be acknowledged. Meaning there are no literalistic two people in the future at the end of time who will come and prophesy in Jerusalem, described in these texts. And in fact, if any do, they have nothing to do with John's prophecy in Revelation chapter 11. Because he gives the date of what he is talking about prophetically, and it is a very long way from the end of the world. Secondly, John states that the two witnesses he is describing are symbolical, equating them to the two trees in Zechariah 4 and the two Sabbath candles, and stating that they are positioned in heaven, in the presence of God. He does not use the phrase "they are like these things," but that they are these things, ruling out a literalistic interpretation. Thirdly, he says they retaliate against their enemies for being burned to death by burning their enemies to death in the very same way. And then goes on to describe more things they do afterwards, obviously ruling out a literalistic reference to two people. Fourthly, John describes the beast declaring a war against the two witnesses, using a term that refers to armies and nations, not individuals. You do not wage a war against only two people, you have a fight with them. John uses the term that refers to entire armies and nations. A war between nations. And that is after they have already been burned to death. Fifthly, he says at the end of this war, the witnesses are defeated and killed, which is after they have already been burned to death. You cannot kill someone who has already been burned to death. Once again, ruling out the Counter-Reformation's literalistic interpretation of only two people. And sixthly, they are revived or awakened in verse 11 and afterwards ascend into heaven, where John has stated in verse 4, they already are. You cannot ascend into a place you already are. Once again, ruling out the Counter-Reformation's literalistic interpretation. After all these factual contradictions in the text, with the Counter-Reformation's literalistic interpretation of the two witnesses, there is said to be an earthquake in Jerusalem in verse 13. But the demographics, the funerary laws, the legal procedures, and the population density are all mentioned in the text, and none of which describe a present day or a future city of Jerusalem. From the descriptions in the text itself, Jerusalem is described as a small town of 70,000 or less in population, and is under Gentile control, with Gentile demographics. Its residents are described as coming from many nations, and at a time when there are no funerary laws, no city morgues, and no sanitation laws, requiring the removal or burial of dead bodies in the streets. This places John's description of Jerusalem, historically, clearly before the end of the 1800s. The two witnesses are described by John as symbolic, and Jerusalem is described by John in terms of historical context, not anywhere close to the end of the world, as claimed by Counter-Reformation theology. And those are the raw facts of the text before you ever get to any interpretation for them. Those are simply the ugly raw bare facts of the text, as it is. A full 50% of all the texts in Revelation chapter 11 verses 1 through 14 openly contradict the claims of counter-reformationist eschatology about this chapter. A full 50%. And as you saw previously, John uses the phrase 7 voices to describe the coming of John Wycliffe and the Lollards, because the Lollards had 7 founders and the word Lollard itself means to mumble with the voice. And they were responsible for bringing forth our modern Bible, which John refers to as the Bibliaridion in chapter 10. In chapter 11, he continues this same prophecy, describing 2 witnesses, and as you saw, the word Protestant comes from the Latin word which means to bear witness. The number 2 is relevant because they were originally called by 2 names, Calvinists or Lutherans, thus John's use of the number 2 for these witnesses, because they literally were known by 2 names. And they are described in verse 3 as being clothed in reform, which in fact is precisely what they were, being later called the Reformation. And you've seen, in keeping with his stated intent in chapter 1 verse 20, that John overtly states his references to angels do not refer to Greek knights in the sky, but instead are his references to astronomical dating, or signs in the heavens, that date his prophecies throughout history. In chapter 10, his reference to the rainbow angel was a reference to the Grode Mandrake and Saturn over Orion. And here in chapter 11, his references to the 2 witnesses make reference to the constellation Gemini. And his reference to fire coming out of the mouth of the 2 witnesses, a reference to a very unusual astronomical event, which involved Mars in a random retrograde motion, passing over the mouth star, Eugeminorium, in the constellation Gemini. And as you have seen previously, John's timeline places these events over a 444-year period, which cover that period of history known as the Reformation, for which the symbol of the 2 witnesses, in his text in chapter 11, is used to refer to and describe. In the same way that the phrase 7 voices was used to refer to and describe the coming of the Grode Mandrake or Great Drowning of Men, the Wycliffe movement, the production of the modern Bible, and the Lollards. And at the close of chapter 10, he states that the rainbow angel has his hand lifted to heaven, having sworn an oath that Kronos should be no more. And then in chapter 11, the same angel introduces his 2 witnesses, which are witnesses of that very oath, and come to testify of its truthfulness, sworn in the presence of, and in the name of, the living God in heaven. And now we are ready to look at the historical fulfillments of Revelation chapter 11, verse 1 through 14, which John calls the second woe. Once these events occur in history, which he is describing in this text, John states the second woe is completed, and henceforth from that time forward, are in the past. They do not describe future events at the end of the world. He says, openly and emphatically, they are past. Done. Over. Finished and completed. When we begin to look at John's prophecies in Revelation, as fulfilled in history, concerning the rise of the papal empire during the trumpet judgments, we find many amazing fulfillments. Modern New World Order revisionist historians want us to believe the dark ages of the papal empire really wasn't that dark. The rampant disease, violence, death and ignorance that plagued Europe during this time really wasn't all that bad after all. In fact, it was so great, the entire world should return to it. But the problem, of course, is that the Dark Ages really were that dark and miserable. And if you had told anyone just 50 years ago there would be an entire political movement to return to the Dark Ages, they would have thought you had gone completely insane. And they would have been right. And today's modern religious political engineers have done precisely that. But the problem with the papal Dark Ages wasn't just that they were filled with darkness on every level. It was that during this time in history, Western society was under the judgment of God for what it was doing. Because the papacy was not simply just a bad idea, politically, which fomented the rise of political fascism. The rise of the papal empire wasn't just anti-scientific, spreading the rampant darkness of superstition, mass deception and mass ignorance. The rise of the papal empire wasn't just built entirely on mass public brainwashing, propaganda and historical make-believe. It wasn't just unclean, perverted sexually, dirty, unhealthy and violent. It was also the rise of the Antichrist. And thus why all these things existed, the way they did, during that period of history known as the Dark Ages. Including why they were called dark. What you will see in chapter 11, is more evidence, that the papacy was in fact the Antichrist in history, and also all the suffering and sadness the rise of that entity in history brought to the people who both fought against it, and embraced it. And while it brought misery to all, whether they were for, or against it, according to the New Testament, it additionally brought eternal damnation, to those who joined themselves to it, embraced it, and defended it by violence and deceit, through the ages. Before we get to the historical fulfillment of chapter 11 verses 1 through 14, we need to look at 3 points of historical background. First, the emergence of the two witnesses movement in history. Secondly, the practice of burning witnesses at the stake. And thirdly, two propaganda words, used by the Counter-Reformation, to make all this magically disappear. Those two words, being dualism and monism. First, let's review why John used the symbol of two witnesses to describe the historical subject of these prophecies. And let's look a little closer at how that paralleled the emergence of the term Protestant, from the Latin word protestare, meaning to bear witness. In chapter 10, you saw that the 7 voices were a reference to Lollard, meaning to mumble with a voice, and 7 being prophesied, because there were, in fact, 7 founders to the Lollard movement. When we come to chapter 11, John mentions two witnesses. He uses the term witnesses because the origin of the word Protestant means to bear witness, and two because as a derogatory tactic, they were called by 2 names only. But the use of the term witnesses, and the reference to 2, and described as clothed in sackcloth, all have very specific and obvious historical identifiers, even beyond what has already been shown. Protestantism looked to emulate those things found in the New Testament. Protestant theology saw the New Testament as the standard for what the apostles originally taught, because the New Testament is the primary source documentation for the original Christian faith taught by the apostles. This fact had been acknowledged even by Rome's own Latin fathers in some of the very first ecumenical councils ever convened, even though the Vatican itself found this early confession to be a threat to its authority, based on the secular and religious political conventions of the Roman Empire. One of the things that these protestares, or Protestants, emulated uniquely was that in medieval Europe, religious ideology was usually spread by military means. A region was conquered, and then forced conversion to the religion of the conqueror was required by all its conquered subjects to avoid persecution or execution. This was true of most imperial religious systems of that time. But when Reformation biblical scholars looked at the subject of spreading faith in the New Testament, they did not see the imperial model based upon military conquest and political subjugation. They did not see religious autocracies issuing imperial mandates and decrees with threats of punishment of death to spread the faith. They saw something entirely different. They saw the pattern of 2 witnesses being sent out, going house to house and door to door, preaching the good news of the kingdom of God. And people, house by house, and individual by individual, choosing to accept or reject that message. And the consequences of that decision, left to God alone. No earthly government was given the right or authority to enforce or punish that decision. It was left to God alone to punish or reward, in this life, or the one hereafter. So they adopted that very same pattern in spreading their faith. It came to be known as witnessing, a term that, unknown to many who even used it, was actually the prophetic fulfillment of Revelation chapter 11, and the coming of the 2 witnesses. It was the age of witnessing. And the witnesses, a movement clothed in sackcloth or reform, spanning the earth, with witnesses, 2 by 2. This terminology was never used by imperial models because there was never any reason for it. the king or conqueror simply issued an edict and all their subjects had to comply. There was no individual or personal volition involved in religious identity or belief. You were whatever your country said you were at birth, based upon authoritarian or government decree. Witnessing challenged this notion of religion by authoritarian decree, and led to the formation of our modern democracies, and the ideas of separation of church and state, and religious freedom for all people. The terminology of witnessing was not an accident. It was used because that was the biblical description of what Christ's disciples did. And the people who went out witnessing were called witnesses. And they gave their testimony. Those terms, testimony and witnesses, are seen in Revelation chapter 11, to describe the emergence of this very movement in history. And it is not an accident that Protestants adopted these very terms in spreading their faith, or making witnesses, as the expression used to be said. These were the very terms John used in Revelation 11, just as John used the imagery of 7 voices in chapter 10, to describe the emergence of Wycliffe and the Lollards, and the coming of our modern Bible, that produced those very same witnesses. Before the Counter-Reformation replaced Christianity in America, people who are older can still remember these practices of witnessing, and how they were still done by most Christian evangelical churches, just 40 or 50 years ago. There were entire organizations created to help people learn how to go out and witness to neighborhoods, public venues, on street corners. Witnessing was done anywhere there was a place to have conversation. And this is how the protestare, meaning to bear witness, spread the Reformed or repentant Christian faith. These old practices are still conducted by religious minorities, such as the Mormons or the Jehovah's Witnesses, into our modern day, because these religions were created in history, at a time when this was common practice among Protestants, which they wanted to be seen as an extension of. After Protestantism was defeated by the Counter-Reformation, these practices were quietly discontinued, and replaced with celebrity TV evangelists, and television mega-church preachers. And they were also no longer spreading repentant Christianity. They were spreading the Christianity of the Roman Empire, along with its political agenda of religious authoritarianism, and submission to the papacy of Rome, along with the occult belief hidden underneath it, that Christ and the Antichrist are secretly the same thing. Chapter 11 is a prophetic description of those events in history which come as a result of the coming of the Bibliaridian, prophesied in chapter 10. And the 2 witnesses described in chapter 11 are symbolic of the subsequent religious events in history it would produce. Just as the Bibliaridian itself would have 2 witnesses contained within it, as the Old Testament and the New Testament itself. The words testament and testimony actually come from the same root terms, and are both the actions and result of something called a witness. Thus John's use of these terms and symbols in chapter 11. As individuals, both Calvin and Luther, the 2 names by which the protestare were called, were raised Roman Catholic, and never fully escaped their indoctrinations into Roman Catholic theology. Luther remained consistent with Roman Catholic anti-Semitism late into his life, which later in history became a source of propaganda for Hitler, and Calvin himself became guilty of burning his own heretic at the stake, an enlightened genius reformer, by the name of Michael Servetus. His only crime was refusal to accept the Roman Catholic doctrine of the Trinity, absent any reference to it in the scriptures. Many of Calvin's own followers turned against him as a result of this tragic event, and yet even then, they were still referred to as Calvinists. The 2 names of Luther and Calvin were how the protestare, collectively, came to become 2 witnesses. Luther and Calvin were not the 2 witnesses themselves. And this is a very important clarification to make. The 2 witnesses were themselves symbolic of nothing more than the 2 witnesses found in the Bibliaridian, or Bible, the Old and New Testaments. It was a prophetic symbolism to refer to the coming of a movement and another age in history. And the 2 testaments, or testimonies, or witnesses, found within the scriptures, which John referred to prophetically as the Bibliaridian, or Bible. The very reason we have witnessing across the world today, instead of religion, by military conquest, is because the age of the 2 witnesses came to pass in history, and John's prophecy in Revelation chapter 11 was fulfilled. And it led to the very changes you see in the world we have today. The second point of historical background information we need to examine is the burning of witnesses. As you saw in chapter 9, John is prophesying major events in history. In chapter 9 he prophesies the two inquisitions. Chapter 11, verse 5, brings up the subject of the burning of heretics, which was also a major horror in history, along with the inquisitions. The burning of heretics is a very big subject and cannot be fully addressed in this short reference to the subject in this video. It had a very long history, which the Vatican inherited from the Roman Empire, stretching as far back as ancient pagan Athens, Greece. If you listen to Greek Orthodox and Roman Catholic sources, it never happened, because it was done by governments, not ecclesiastical executioners, or it happened, but it really happened on such a small scale, it was irrelevant, or it was actually the Orthodox or Roman Church trying to stop burnings from happening, by having a proper formal trial, which is why inquisitions were instituted. And of course, they will point out that Protestants did it too. Therefore the subject is a moot point. And if all that still fails, they will admit it was done, but since the Catholic Church is the only means of salvation, it was an effort to save souls from hell, and really, it was fully justified. There is an entire cottage industry in existence today to spin doctor this period of history, to no end. And no claim, no matter how ridiculous it may be historically, will be off limits for them, in their explanations. But these recent attempts at spin doctoring the past, which has been fully and accurately known for centuries, are nothing more than modern political counter-reformation fiction. So let's quickly respond to each point. 1. It was done by secular governments, not the Vatican. Therefore it doesn't count. The problem with this claim is that there were no secular governments in those days. Governments were linked to the state church. The government conducted those executions as a result of ecclesiastical trials, where the church declared these people heretics, and recommended them for execution. The fact that a priest was not up on the scaffold personally lighting the fire is irrelevant. 2. Very few people really died. This claim is patently bogus. There was not a written record of every single execution that took place. But the burnings and executions were large enough and serious enough to spawn numerous medieval refugee crises of Jews and Protestants fleeing for their lives from European countries under the Inquisitions by the hundreds of thousands. 3. The church was trying to stop mob burnings. This is another bogus claim. Mobs had no authority to burn anyone. Burning someone not convicted of heresy was considered a murder. Both the practice of burning heretics and the permission to do so came directly from Roman governmental authority, stretching all the way back to the time of Emperor Justinian, during the Byzantium Empire. 4. Protestants did it too. Not really. John Calvin burned Michael Servetus, which was one person. The Inquisition sent between 40 to 60,000 individuals to the scaffold, to be burned alive, by Catholic state authorities, on behalf of the Catholic Church. And those are just the numbers cited by Catholic, not Protestant, sources. The magnitude of difference is not comparable. What about Catholic martyrs during the English Reformation? Catholics were being murdered in England by the same government that murdered Protestants as well, because that government was actually neither. England is thrown into the Protestant column, but it was a Masonic monarchical government, which persecuted both groups. That is why there was a group of English Protestants called the Pilgrims, who fled the country first to Holland, and then to America, to find safety from that persecution. Were there murders by Protestant church states in Europe against Catholics? Yes. But once again, the difference in the magnitude of numbers is not even remotely comparable. It is literally like a comparison between the killing of Jews in the United States versus the killing of Jews in Germany during the 1940s. Jews were killed in both countries. However, Jews fled to the United States from Germany, because in reality, there was no comparison between the two. 5. It was justified because the Catholic Church is the only means of salvation, therefore it was justified because it was saving souls from hell. If you have been watching the series, you already see that the Catholic Church was not only never founded by Christ or his apostles, but biblically speaking, the head of the Catholic Church is clearly the prophesied Antichrist. And this fact is not unknown even to Catholics, who see this contradiction as a form of occult wisdom. The apostles never taught that obedience to the Antichrist brought anyone salvation. In fact, they warned quite the opposite was going to be unconditionally the case. So in the end, according to the New Testament, the Catholic Church was not saving anyone. But it quite literally may have been unconditionally damning millions. Burning heretics at the stake was more often than not nothing more than a way to remain in control of its political power. Unfortunately, the fictitious narratives that defend and rationalize the burning of heretics are the ones you are most likely to see on the internet today, and even in historical writings from credible sources, because of the propaganda work of the Counter-Reformation. Some of this garbage is even being dispersed by Counter-Reformationists, by people under the label of various Protestant churches. But this very strange and rather tragically comical historical revisionism did not begin until a few years ago, which for centuries of both secular and religious history remained fully known, admitted and basically unchallenged. Because the Catholic Church of the past did not think of these exterminations as a mark of shame, but rather a badge of honor. And if ever given the right or opportunity, would happily do so again without apologies. And as recently as the year 2005, a discussion page on the website of the Catholic cable channel, EWTN, was posted by a Catholic academic by the name of Dr. Warren Carroll, in which the burning of heretics was defended as rational, reasonable, and nothing Catholics should be apologizing for, to the shock and horror of some Catholics themselves, who never dreamed their modern Catholic Church would still be defending and rationalizing these genocidal atrocities as rational in the modern world. But there it was. In 2005, Dr. Warren Carroll was not just a rogue Catholic zealot extremist. His credentials read as follows, quote, Carroll has received numerous awards throughout his academic career. He received an honorary doctorate in humane letters from Christendom College in 1999, the college's Pro Deo et Patria Award for Distinguished Service to God and Country in 2007, and the college's inaugural Queen Isabel Catholic Vision of History Award in 2007. In 1995, he was the inaugural recipient of the Pope Pius XI Award in History from the Society of Catholic Social Scientists, an organization of which he was a board member. End quote. His argument in defense of the burning of thousands at the stake was that it was fully justified and proper. And it is simply the corruption of modernism that led people to believe in the error that it was not. Given Dr. Carroll's Catholic theology, it would make much more sense if we read in the New Testament that the disciples of Christ went through Israel, house by house, burning people alive. Which obviously is not what we read. Dr. Warren Carroll had also been formerly employed by the CIA, after the merger of the CIA with the Vatican, during the Reagan years, in an effort to fight communism in Eastern Europe. But what is even more substantial than the spin doctoring they do on history concerning this topic, is how they also attempt to actually hide the contents of Revelation chapter 11, that prophesy about it. And that these burnings were not burning just heretics. They were also burning the witnesses that had been sent by God himself, who were the messengers of the Bibliaridion, prophesied in chapter 10. Just as they hid the content of Revelation chapter 9, to hide John's prophecies about the Inquisitions. The burning of witnesses is a major spiritual event in history, and it is referenced here, in verse 5, as the fifth prophecy in chapter 11, against the Antichrist, who is precisely who conducted them in history. But, rather than justify or dismiss them, John's prophecy comes with a dire warning about God's judgment against that gruesome and horrific practice, as you will see in a few minutes. The third point of historical background has to do with the use of two words that have become propaganda slogans. Orthodox and Catholic sources would like the public to believe that none of the scores of thousands of Europeans who were burned to death were actually Christians, because they refused to accept the doctrines and religious authority of the Orthodox or Catholic Church. And they make this claim by branding all the thousands of European Christians they burned to death with the label of dualist, and then claim based on this label they were therefore Gnostics, not Christians, despite the fact these same Christians being burned to death were claiming the authority for their faith was the apostolic teaching from the New Testament, which of course is a conceptual contradiction that doesn't make much sense. When you read articles authored by the current-day New World Order historical revisionism school of thought, you will see certain key phrases being used. And unless you are familiar with what those phrases are being used to hide, you will have no idea what you are really reading. When the papacy began its crusade of burning witnesses, there were dissident evangelical Christians all over Europe, even before the time of Wycliffe. They rejected the Roman papacy, identifying it as the Antichrist, just as Wycliffe, the Lollards, and later the entire Reformation, came to do. Today, however, when you read about these groups, you will be told they were all just an assortment of nasty non-Christian heretics. You will be told they were all Gnostics, which they were not. Our current historical revisionists want you to believe there was not a single valid Christian among any of the tens of thousands of European Christians burned, and they will tell you with a straight face, they were all dualist Gnostics. But when you hear that term dualist, here is what you should know, that they are hiding behind it. Dualist means two, and monist means one. And when they explain that a dualist is someone who thinks there are two gods fighting against one another, everyone recognizes that idea as not consistent with the scriptures, just as the actual European Christians did, outside Roman Catholicism, in medieval Europe. Those very same Christians they are now attempting to rebrand as dualists and Gnostics. By dualist, these sources actually mean that these groups thought that when they read in the New Testament about Christ and the Antichrist, those were two separate and opposite things, as they are presented in the New Testament, and should not be confused as one and the same, as Vatican theology actually does. Which is why the Vatican is attempting to promote the idea of monism, without ever explaining the implication of what they mean by the term. Meaning one. Christians who do not want to follow the Antichrist, or think there is something wrong with that, are therefore labeled heretic dualists. All of them. Including hundreds of thousands of pre-Catholic European Christians. So if you are watching this video, and agree with what you are learning, according to these same sources, you are a heretic dualist Gnostic, simply because you don't want to follow the Antichrist. Or think, based on the New Testament, there is something mistaken about that notion. Because, if you are a monist, you would realize, as the Vatican does, that Christ and the Antichrist are both the Pope of Rome. These are the same thing. They are one. Thus the label, monism. So there is no harm or concern in following the Pope, as both Christ and the Antichrist, at the same time, despite what the scriptures teach about that subject, and the warnings openly and repeatedly given about unconditional eternal damnation for doing it. In essence, if you are a monist, as they mean it, you will make no distinction between an arsenic pill and a vitamin, it's all one. However, if you object, and refuse to take the arsenic pill, distinguishing it as essentially different from a vitamin, then you are a dualist. And if you are a dualist, it is simply because you are ignorant and stupid, and do not realize this came from Zoroastrianism, or Gnosticism, or some other kind of imaginaryism. But the truth is, these fictitious religious labels are simply ways to manipulate the unsuspecting masses into accepting the idea it is okay to follow the Antichrist, despite the warnings and condemnations in the New Testament, without ever telling those same audiences what they are being manipulated into through these ambiguous, misused and distorted labels. That is why the Catholic saint, Catherine of Siena actually said, quote, "Even if the Pope were Satan incarnate, we ought not to raise up our heads against him, but calmly lie down to rest on his bosom. He who rebels against our Father is condemned to death, for that which we do to him we do to Christ. We honor Christ if we honor the Pope. We dishonor Christ if we dishonor the Pope." End quote. Do you see how she references both Christ and Satan in the Pope? And says even if it is actually Satan incarnate, it is still Christ? You see in St. Catherine's theology, that Satan and Christ, both, can be resident in the Pope without conflict or contradiction, and therefore absolute obedience to the Pope, even as Satan or the Antichrist himself, is unconditionally demanded. If you reject the synthesis, because you have no interest in being a follower of the Antichrist, then they call you a dualist, a heretic and a Gnostic. despite the fact this very ideology came directly from the Gnostics themselves, Rome now calls the Desert Fathers. The same Gnostics that produced the entire Gnostic library, found at Nag Hammadi in the 1940s, connected to St. Pachomius Monastery in Egypt. So this ridiculous non-historical claim, made by apologists of the modern New World Order Roman Reich, is both egregious and offensive to anyone familiar with the real history of those things being discussed. That is what they mean, but never explain, by the term dualist. And that's how the Vatican, and its collaborators, use these new religious labels to dismiss pre-Roman Catholic Christians from history that they feel threatened by. Of course, the use of this kind of religious derogatory labeling for people who reject following the Antichrist means the apostles of the New Testament themselves would have all been Gnostic dualists as well, including the real Christ, who is the original source of their own theology. And that is the problem with using derogatory theological labels to dismiss factual elements found in the New Testament. Whatever ugly label you wish to label someone who stands on New Testament theology, you must also, by necessity, extend that same ugly label to the New Testament apostles, who are associated with the production of that material, and to the Christ of the New Testament, who was its original source. And if you are going to label Christ with such labels, why bother, hypocritically, claiming you follow him, when clearly, by your own confession, you prefer not to? But once again, that is something they never bother to explain to the ignorant masses. They are busy manipulating with those dishonest tricks using ambiguous shifty labels, such as dualism and monism, neither of which you will find in your New Testament. According to the New Testament, if you follow the Antichrist, you will be unconditionally damned. There is no stronger warning in the entire Bible against any religious figure in history or on planet Earth. The Antichrist is presented as an extension of Satan's plan on the earth, not God's. The Antichrist is the arsenic pill that will kill you. That is what Christ and the apostles taught. And it is also found replete in Jewish literature throughout the ages, where after the time of Christ, rabbis replaced the term Antichrist with the name Armilus, which was an open reference to the Pontifex Maximus, or head religious figure, of Rome. The Eastern European Christians were called Bogomils, Paulicians and various other derogatory labels, and were being burned in the East, in the city of Constantinople. The Bogomils, along with Lollards and John Wycliffe, were an important influence on John Huss, who was later burned in the city of Prague in the 1400s. Now that we have covered this basic historical background material, relevant to Chapter 11, let's look at its actual fulfillment in history. As you saw previously, we have a list of 13 prophecies in chapter 11 verses 1 through 14, which John calls the second woe. The second woe comes in between the sixth trumpet in chapter 9 and the seventh trumpet at the end of chapter 11. Chapter 10 and chapter 11 verses 1 through 14 are all part of the same prophecy. John prophesies the rainbow angel, the seven voices, the coming of the Bibliaridion, and then begins chapter 11 with the measuring reed and the two witnesses. These are all part of the same prophecy. So, if you take the two witnesses as a literalism, then you must take the same interpretation with the seven voices, which is naturally never done. Despite the inconsistency this creates for counter-reformationists. While they often present illustrations of two literal witnesses blowing fire out of their mouths from chapter 11, you never see them illustrate seven literal mouths in the sky from chapter 10. But if you do not take the seven voices as literalism, then how can you take the two witnesses as any less symbolic? Without creating a huge discrepancy. Which is precisely what they do. Next time you see a picture of two witnesses blowing fire out of their mouth, ask yourself, where is the picture of seven literal mouths in the sky that precede it? Because they are both part of the same prophecy. The way you interpret the seven voices in chapter 10 is precisely how you should also interpret the two witnesses in chapter 11. There should be no discrepancy in the way you interpret these two texts. And while there is a huge discrepancy created in Counter-Reformation theology, there is perfect consistency between these two texts in the historical interpretation. And it also correlates precisely, to what actually happened in real history. In verse 1, we have John transition from the biblioridion to the measuring reed. He is told after eating the book, that he is given a measuring reed to measure the temple, the sacrifice, and those that worship therein. Indicating that the biblioridion creates a standard of measurement. The date for this event was 1390, and we know this happened, historically. Since the publication of the Wycliffe Bible, it has been estimated that 6 billion Bibles have been printed, and personally owned. It has in fact, become a standard of religious measurement across the world. It is also the #1 read, religious text, on planet Earth. More people have read the Bible than any other religious text, by far. And, it serves as the historical primary source documentation, for the world's largest religious traditions in existence. It truly historically created a religious standard of faith and practice, that has reached more people across the world, than any single religious group, organization or institution in existence, including the papacy, in Rome. It did indeed, literally, become the measuring reed, to measure the temple, the sacrifice, and the worshippers therein. Precisely, as we see John begin this chapter. After prophesying the coming of the book, at the end of chapter 10, which he is told to devour. That was the first prophecy on our checklist, which we can mark fulfilled. And as we go through each of these prophecies, you can see how the claims of Counter-Reformation eschatology concerning Revelation 11 will begin to go up in flames. Beginning with the very first prophecy in the chapter. The second prophecy on the list was that Jerusalem would be under Gentile control, which we also know, from history, was the case during this time. John states in verse 2, that at the time of the coming of the two witnesses, Jerusalem will have been given to the Gentiles, and will be in the process of being trampled by the Gentiles. Now this is a very important detail about this prophecy, because Counter-Reformationists claim in their eschatology scheme, that Jews have all come back to Israel, and this modern Jewish state of Israel will exist until the rapture, at which time the two witnesses come, or just before it, depending on the variation. But they all claim the modern Jewish state of Israel is the setting for this prophecy. But in making that claim, they have created another huge problem in their interpretation of chapter 11. Not only does John's time frame clearly disagree with them about when these events are to happen, even his description of the city of Jerusalem itself, where these events are prophesied to take place, disagrees with them. John states in verse 2, the two witnesses come at a time when Gentiles are trampling the city of Jerusalem. And then later in verse 9, he claims Gentiles are the main residents of the city. That is why they have to get toward verse 9, into invisibility. If you read what is there, you will immediately see, there is a major problem. They want to claim they prophesied the restoration of the modern Jewish state, and claim to be Zionists, along with the Jews who predominate the population base of the modern city, but at the same time, they want to claim the two witnesses are still future. Which they cannot do, without simply lying. Which is precisely what they do. The two witnesses come at a time in history, when Jerusalem is being trampled by Gentiles. That is clearly in the text in verse 2. Which means you cannot have a future two witnesses, and an already existing Jewish state. Those two claims are directly contradictory, given the actual text in chapter 11. The two witnesses clearly occur in history in verse 3, at a time in history, when Jerusalem is under Gentile possession and control, stated overtly, in verse 2 and 9. There is no honest question that this is the case in the text. It couldn't be any clearer from the text. This is the case. So, next time you see someone show you a picture of two fire-breathing end-time prophets burning Muslims alive on the streets of Jerusalem, ask the person, where did all the Jews go? If they say they are all still there, then inform them their picture has nothing to do with Revelation 11. Because in Revelation 11, Gentiles are the residents of Jerusalem, and have control of the city. And so their picture is a work of imagination and fiction, and has nothing to do with Revelation chapter 11. In 1377 AD, Jerusalem participated in something known as the Mamluk-Syrian Revolt, which was a revolt of Arab peasants, following the death of Al-Ashraf Shaban. Although the revolt was defeated, a Circassian-led coup d'état was successfully staged in Egypt, and led to the rule of Al-Malik az-Zahir Safd-din Barkat, who established the beginning of the Barkat dynasty. Circassians were a Caucasian ethnicity from the region between modern-day southern Russia and northern Georgia. The religious landscape of Jerusalem, at the time, following the last of the Crusades, included a predominant mixture of Catholic, Orthodox, Armenian, and Muslim populations. Jews at the time constituted a very small percentage of the population, having been expelled from the area since the time of Hadrian, and were frequently made the target of ethnic cleansings by a rotation of Gentile conquerors of the city. So the second prophecy occurred, and we can mark that as fulfilled. The Counter-Reformationists, however, are left with a very large discrepancy they cannot explain. You cannot have the emergence of the two witnesses and the Jewish state of Israel at the same time. The text in chapter 11 eliminates that claim as valid. And once again we see Counter-Reformation theology going up in flames on a detailed examination of the actual text in Revelation chapter 11. In verse 3, John states that the rainbow angel of chapter 10 will give power to his two witnesses and they will prophesy clothed in sackcloth. As explained in the previous video, sackcloth was a Hebrew custom associated with what is translated into English as repentance, or reform. We noted this was the year 1516 AD on John's astronomically dated timeline. And we also noted that the year of this event would be confirmed astronomically by the sign in the heavens of two eclipses, and Jupiter moving into Gemini. So what happened in the year 1516 AD? If you go to Google and type in the year 1516 AD, this is the page that will pop up. If you notice the last three entries on the bottom of your screen, you will see three links: a total eclipse of July 13th, a total eclipse of January 19th, and a link to an article about the Textus Receptus. Right there is the sign in the heavens of the two eclipses. Ironically, in the very year 1516 AD, there were precisely two total lunar eclipses which covered the eastern and western hemispheres. And amazingly, precisely as was indicated by the text, in the very same year, Jupiter moved into Gemini. But what is the Textus Receptus, and how did it empower the two witnesses? The Textus Receptus is the Greek New Testament, which was the original language the New Testament was written in. It was published in the year 1516 AD by a New Testament linguistic scholar by the name of Erasmus. As mentioned earlier, for several centuries, the only language the Bible was allowed to be read in was the Latin Vulgate translation of the Bible into Latin, giving the papacy a monopoly of knowledge concerning the texts in the Bible. When the Wycliffe movement and the Lollards came, they ended that monopoly by translating the Latin Vulgate into the common language. Remember, the name Lollards was chosen as a derogatory insult name, and in doing that very thing, the Vatican actually fulfilled the prophecies of Revelation chapter 10 concerning them. When the Vatican attempted to isolate the Reformation by calling all reformers by the names of just two people, it backfired again, and fulfilled John's very prophecies about it in chapter 11, just as they had done, in accidentally fulfilling the events prophesied in chapter 10 concerning the Lollards. But the Textus Receptus played a key role in the coming of the Reformation, which John is prophesying about as the two witnesses. Here is an article by Christianity Today on the publication of the Textus Receptus. As you can see, the title of the article is, quote, "Erasmus loaded the Reformation canon," end quote. The first sentence of this article reads as follows, quote, "Erasmus loaded the cannon that Luther fired." The greatest scholar of his day, Erasmus, rammed two shots into the barrel of the Reformation canon, end quote. In this very title, you can see precisely how publication of the Textus Receptus New Testament empowered the two witnesses of the Reformation. But not only do we find this event as a real event in history, we also see the signs in the heavens that confirmed its importance. Not only in that very year did 2 total lunar eclipses cover the world, but as you see on your screen, in that very same year, Jupiter moved into Gemini. But not only did it move into Gemini, in the very same exact month, the month of February, that the Textus Receptus was published. The very same exact month. On the 22nd day of the second month, 1516 AD. And what are the odds of that? The very next year, in 1517, historians consider the full-blown Reformation, now fully underway, with the publication of Luther's 95 Theses, in Wittenberg, Germany. Drawn largely from Luther's study of the Greek Textus Receptus, New Testament. Published by Erasmus in 1516 AD. So we see that prophecy number 3, was in fact, dramatically fulfilled along with John's signs in the heavens, precisely as he had prophesied. So we can mark prophecy number 3 fulfilled on our checklist. In the third prophecy, we see John's astronomically dated timeline beginning to emerge in history with the empowerment of the 2 witnesses, and the accompanying signs in the heavens that confirm the event on earth. And, we also see again, the claims of Counter-Reformation theology concerning Revelation chapter 11, continuing to go up in flames. The next prophecy on our list, prophecy number 4, is the statement that these 2 witnesses are also the 2 trees and 2 candlesticks. The text prophesies the identification of the 2 witnesses, now at this time in history. And this identification is marked for the year 1520. So what happened in the year 1520? In 1520, Martin Luther published 3 monumental works calling for Reformation. The first was entitled, To the Christian Nobility of the German Nation. The second was entitled, On the Babylonian Captivity of the Church. And the third was entitled, On the Freedom of a Christian. In the work entitled, On the Babylonian Captivity of the Church, which was published in October of 1520, he openly identifies the papacy as the Antichrist, and the fulfillment of the prophecies, in John's book of Revelation. The work was published in both Latin and German. At this very same time, in this very same year, John Calvin was selected to receive church benefits, to study theology and canon law, at the University of Orleans. But that is not all that happened in the year 1520 AD. In the very same month of October, that Luther's work entitled, The Babylonian Captivity of the Church, was being published by Luther, in which he openly identifies the papacy as the Antichrist. A large, double meteor shower, is seen over the skies of Jerusalem, in the constellation of Gemini, positioned directly over the western horizon. Thus fulfilling the signs in the heavens, in John's prophecy, in the exact year, and in the exact month, that Luther's publication identified the papacy as the prophesied Antichrist. This is the second astronomical date that predicted astronomical events in the heavens to mark the timeline of John's prophecies. And in both cases, the astronomical signs in the heavens occurred to the very month of the events on Earth. If this were simply imagination and invention, there is no way these things could possibly occur to the exact date and times that they do. So we see that prophecy number 4 on our checklist of prophecies was fulfilled, once again, in a rather dramatic fashion, precisely as John had prophesied. Along with his astronomical signs in the heavens, confirming the astronomical dating in his prophetic timeline. And we see again, the claims of Counter-Reformation theology concerning Revelation chapter 11, continue to go up in flames. In this video, you saw that, as John referred to the 7 voices, as a reference to the Lollards in chapter 10, and the coming of our modern Bible, so too, John uses the prophetic description of 2 witnesses, to describe the coming of the Protestant Reformation. The term Protestant, literally coming from the Latin word, protestare, meaning to bear witness. And 2 because they were all called by only 2 names: Lutherans and Calvinists. You also saw that the signs in the heavens, John prophesies, accompanied these historic events, down to the very month and days of their occurrences, confirming both John's astronomically dated timeline, and the significance of these events in history. In the next video, we will continue through the remaining prophecies in Revelation chapter 11, verses 1 through 14, beginning with prophecy number 5, the burning of the witnesses. And once again you will see how these prophecies had both amazingly specific and accurate fulfillments in history. And you will also see what the Counter-Reformation has been working so hard to hide from the public for centuries. Don't miss the exciting conclusion to John's first prophecy, in Revelation chapter 11 verses 1 through 14, in the next video. Thank you for watching.